A scientist once convinced a room full of nurses to nearly poison a patient just by pretending to be a doctor on the phone. Yeah, that's on this list. So is the guy who put 3 men who all believed they were Jesus Christ in the same room just to see what would happen. It went about as well as you'd expect. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 of the creepiest psychology experiments ever conducted. 25. The Testicular Transplants of Dr. Stanley. Between 1913 and the 1940s, Dr. Leo Stanley served as chief surgeon at San Quentin State Prison in California. He used that position to conduct experiments that sound like something out of a horror movie. Stanley believed he could rejuvenate aging men, boost their vitality, and even cure criminal behavior by transplanting testicles. He removed them from executed inmates and implanted them into living prisoners, often without anything resembling proper consent. Some procedures involved grafting tissue from animals instead. The surgeries were medically unsound, unhygienic, and left patients dealing with infections, pain, and complications that nobody bothered to track or treat properly. Stanley genuinely thought he was pushing medicine forward, but what he was actually doing was treating incarcerated men as lab rats for ideas that had no scientific basis. By the time he finally stopped, he'd performed hundreds of these procedures already. Today, his work stands as one of the clearest examples of what happens when someone with medical authority faces zero oversight and decides that prisoners don't deserve the same protections as everyone else. 24. The Learned Helplessness Experiment. In 1967, psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Mayer wanted to know what happens when you're stuck in a situation you can't escape. They decided to find out using dogs and electric shocks. The experiment split the dogs into 2 groups. One group could end the shocks by taking action, like hitting a lever or hopping over a low wall. The other group had no options at all and just had to wait it out. The real test came later, when all the dogs were moved to a new setup where escape was possible for everyone. The ones who had previously been able to control their situation figured it out immediately, but the dogs who had previously experienced shocks with no way out didn't bother trying to escape. They just sat there accepting the pain, even though they could have easily gotten away. Seligman called this learned helplessness, and it changed how psychologists think about depression and trauma. When you're exposed to enough pain you can't control, your brain eventually stops believing escape is possible, even when it is. 23. Berger's replication of Milgram. Back in 1961, Stanley Milgram convinced ordinary people to electrocute a stranger just by having a guy in a lab coat tell them to do it. The shocks were not real, but the patients didn't know that, and 65% of them kept going all the way to what they believed was a dangerous voltage. In 2009, psychologist Jerry Berger wanted to see if anything had changed, so he ran an updated version with safety upgrades so ethics boards wouldn't shut it down. Participants got screened first, and the whole thing stopped before anyone thought they were delivering fatal shocks. You'd think that after decades of knowing about Milgram's results, people would refuse to keep shocking someone in pain. That's not what happened. A massive number of participants still did exactly what they were told. Turns out humans in 2009 were just as obedient to authority as humans were in 1961. We know better, but we don't do better. 22. Hofling Hospital Experiment. In 1966, psychologist Charles Hofling wanted to know if obedience happened outside the lab. So, he targeted nurses at actual hospitals and put them in an impossible situation. A stranger called the hospital claiming to be a doctor and told nurses to immediately give patients a dangerous dose of a made-up drug called astroten. Everything about this scenario should have raised alarms. The caller wasn't a known doctor, the drug wasn't approved, the dose was way too high, and hospital policy strictly forbade taking phone orders from strangers. Out of 22 nurses, 21 of them went to go grab the medication and were ready to administer it before they were stopped. They were about to poison a patient because someone on the phone said they were a doctor. Hierarchies are powerful, and questioning someone higher up in the chain feels impossible, even when lives are on the line. 21. Asch Conformity Experiments. Ever agree with something you knew was wrong just because everyone else said it first? In 1951, psychologist Solomon Asch proved that peer pressure can make people deny what's right in front of their own eyes. Asch brought participants into a room with a group of people who were secretly actors. Everyone was shown 2 cards, one with a single line and another with 3 lines of different lengths. And the task was stupidly simple. Match the line on the first card to the identical one on the second card. I mean, a toddler could do it. The actors gave incorrect answers out loud, and about 1/3 of the real participants went along with the group's obviously incorrect answer at least once. They could see with their own eyes which line matched, but pressure to conform was so strong they ignored reality and agreed with the group anyway. This proves we'd rather be wrong with the crowd than right by ourselves. 20. Internet rehabilitation camps. In the 2000s, China was convinced that teens glued to their computers were a threat to society. The government's answer was boot camps, hundreds of them, promising to snap kids out of their online obsession through military-style discipline. Anyone who thought their children were addicted to screens could send them to one of these facilities, often against the kids' will. Once inside, teens faced a brutal routine of physical drills, forced confessions about their addiction, and punishments for breaking rules. The people running these camps weren't medical professionals. They were often former military officers who believed the problem could be beaten out of kids if you pushed hard enough. Nobody was really watching what went on behind closed doors. Stories eventually leaked about beatings, starvation, and teens who didn't survive the treatment. By the time journalists and human rights groups started paying attention, the damage had already been done to thousands of kids whose parents thought they were helping them. 19. Rosenhan Experiment. In 1973, psychologist David Rosenhan wanted to know how reliable psychiatric diagnoses really were, so he sent 8 perfectly sane people into mental hospitals to find out. These pseudo-patients were completely normal and mentally healthy. Their only job was to fake hearing voices long enough to get admitted, then act totally fine and tell the staff they felt great. Simple enough, right? Not even close. Every single one of them got diagnosed with schizophrenia. The hospitals gave them antipsychotics, kept them for weeks, and treated everything they did as a symptom of their fake illness. One guy took notes during his stay, and the staff wrote in his chart that his writing behavior was evidence of his mental disorder. Jotting things down in a notebook was apparently a sign of insanity. The whole experiment exposed a massive problem. Once someone gets labeled mentally ill, the label sticks to everything they do. Staff saw what they expected to see and ignored what was right in front of them. Turns out psychiatric hospitals in the 70s weren't great at figuring out who actually needed to be there. 18. The Bobo doll experiment. Psychologist Albert Bandura had a theory in the early 60s that kids don't need to experience aggression firsthand to become aggressive themselves. He believed watching it happen was enough, and he designed an experiment to prove it. He brought children into a playroom and let them observe an adult interacting with a big inflatable clown toy. Half the kids saw the adult go absolutely wild on the thing, while the other half saw the adult ignore it completely. Afterward, each child got their own turn in the room with that same clown. You can probably guess what happened. The children who witnessed the beatdown copied it almost move for move, while the others played peacefully. What kids see, kids do, and Bandura had the footage to prove it. 17. Robbers Cave Experiment. What happens when you pit entire groups against each other? In 1954, psychologist Mozart Sharif decided to find out by turning a summer camp into a war zone. Sharif gathered 22 11-year-old boys at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma and divided them into 2 separate groups. Neither group knew the other existed at first, and both spent the early days bonding and coming up with a team name. One called themselves the Rattlers, the others the Eagles. Once both groups had formed strong identities, Sharif brought them together and pitted them against each other in competitions for prizes. Things went from 0 to Lord of the Flies real quick. The boys started hurling insults, raiding each other's cabins, stealing belongings, and burning flags. Fistfights broke out, and researchers had to physically intervene before someone got seriously injured. These were regular kids who'd never met before, and competition turned them into enemies within days. Then, Sharif tried something different. He created problems that forced both groups to work together, like fixing the camp's broken water supply. The anger slowly melted away, and kids from opposing sides actually became friends. 16. The Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes Experiment. Most kids learn about discrimination from a textbook, but Jane Elliott's third graders learned it by living through it. It was 1968, the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and Elliott knew her all-white class in rural Iowa wasn't going to grasp what had just happened to the country. So instead of explaining it, she turned her classroom into a lesson they'd never forget. She told her students that blue-eyed people were superior to brown-eyed people, and treated them accordingly. The blue-eyed kids became the privileged class, while the brown-eyed kids had to wear collars around their necks so everyone could identify them from across the room. Elliott spent the day praising every little thing the blue-eyed kids did, while tearing down the brown-eyed kids for the smallest mistakes. Kids who had been best friends that morning were at each other's throats by the afternoon. The ones on top got cocky and mean, while the ones wearing collars withdrew completely and started failing work they could normally do in their sleep. Elliott flipped the roles the next day and announced she had had it backwards. The kids who had spent yesterday being humiliated wasted no time returning the favor. Nobody had to teach them how to be cruel. They'd learned that lesson the day before. 15. Quaker Oats Radioactive Oatmeal Experiment. In the late 40s and early 50s, scientists at MIT partnered with Quaker Oats to study how the body absorbs nutrients like iron and calcium. They needed test subjects. So they went to Fernald State School in Massachusetts, a facility that housed children with developmental disabilities. The researchers told these kids they'd been selected for a special science club that came with perks like extra food and fun field trips. What they didn't mention was that the oatmeal and milk they were serving had been laced with radioactive tracers. The children had no idea what they were eating. Their parents were never properly informed about what the study actually involved. For years, researchers tracked how the radiation moved through these kids' bodies, all in the name of understanding nutrition. When the truth finally came out decades later, survivors filed a class action lawsuit. The settlement came out to around $1.85 million, which works out to shockingly little per person when you consider they were fed radioactive food as children without anyone's real consent. 14. The Facial Feedback Hypothesis Experiments. Researchers in the 80s discovered something unsettling about the connection between your body and your emotions. They had participants hold pencils in their mouths while watching cartoons. The trick was that different grips changed what their muscles were doing without them knowing it. Biting down on the pencil with your teeth pulls everything into a grin, while gripping it between your lips has the opposite effect. When asked to rate those cartoons afterward, the people who had been unknowingly grinning found them way funnier than the people whose muscles had been stuck in a frown. What they uncovered was that emotions don't just travel from the brain outward. The signals also run in reverse. Whatever expression you're wearing sends information back to your brain, and your brain adjusts how you feel based on what it's receiving. You can end up feeling happier or sadder purely because of what your muscles happen to be doing at the time. 13. Door in the Face Experiments. You know how salespeople always show you the ridiculously expensive option before revealing something more affordable? Well, you can thank psychologist Robert Cialdini for that annoying tactic. In 1975, Cialdini approached college students and asked if they'd volunteer as unpaid counselors for juvenile delinquents for 2 hours per week for 2 years. Unsurprisingly, almost everyone refused. Then, he asked if they'd chaperone a single one-day trip to the zoo, and suddenly 50 people said yes. When he asked a different group just the zoo question without the ridiculous request first, only 17% agreed. After turning down something huge, people feel guilty and become way more willing to say yes to something smaller. Cialdini called this the door in the face technique, and salespeople have been using it ever since. 12. The Three Christs of Ypsilanti. What happens when you put three men who all believe they're Jesus Christ in the same room? Psychologist Milton Rockich decided to find out in 1959, and it didn't go as he planned. Rockich brought together three men from Ypsilanti State Hospital, all diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and all convinced they were the actual Jesus Christ. His theory was that confronting them with two other guys claiming the same identity would force them to realize their delusion. The three men didn't have existential crises or sudden breakthroughs. Each one just found a way to explain why the other two were fakes. One was convinced the other two were mentally ill patients playing pretend. Another decided they were actually dead bodies being controlled by machines. Nobody changed their mind. and nobody backed down. The experiment didn't cure anyone, nor did it provide any groundbreaking insights. It just put 3 vulnerable men through psychological torment for months while Rockich played mind games with them. Today, it's remembered as a huge ethical failure. 11. The Third Wave Experiment. Ron Jones was a high school history teacher in 1967, and his students wouldn't stop asking the same question. How did regular Germans end up going along with the Nazis? Jones figured the best answer was a demonstration. He started by making his class sit up straight and follow rigid rules about when they could talk. Then, he invented a salute, designed a logo, and came up with catchy slogans about strength and unity. He called the whole thing the Third Wave, and told his students they were special, part of an elite group that was going to do something great. And those kids ate it up. Within a few days, things got scary. Students started ratting each other out for breaking rules, recruiting their friends, and getting aggressive with anyone who didn't want to join. Over 200 kids signed up, and some became genuinely hostile toward non-members. Jones stood there watching his own classroom turn into a miniature dictatorship, and he realized he'd completely lost control. By day 5, Jones gathered everyone together, showed them footage of actual Nazi rallies, and dropped the bomb. They'd recreated fascism in 5 days flat, and they hadn't even noticed it happening. 10. The Vipeholm Experiments. Between 1945 and 1955, researchers in Sweden wanted to understand exactly how sugar destroys teeth. Their test subjects were patients at Vipeholm Hospital, a facility for people with intellectual disabilities who could not consent to what was about to happen to them. The researchers fed these patients massive amounts of candy, chocolate, and sticky sweets on purpose, then watched their teeth rot. Some were given sugar in forms designed to cling to their teeth as long as possible. Also, researchers could track exactly how cavities formed. The study did prove the link between sugar and tooth decay, but the cost was paid entirely by patients who never agreed to have their mouths ruined for science. 9. The Unfortunate Experiment. From the 60s through the 80s, doctors at National Women's Hospital in Auckland, New Zealand, ran a study that put women's lives at risk without telling them. Patients who came in with cervical abnormalities weren't given proper treatment. Instead, doctors withheld them just to see how far the condition would develop on its own. These women had no idea treatment existed and were being deliberately prevented from getting it. The scandal broke in 1987 when the Cartwright inquiry exposed everything. By the time it was over, preventable cancers had spread and lives had been cut short. The fallout forced New Zealand to rewrite its rules on patient consent and research ethics. 8. The Minnesota Starvation Experiment. During World War II, psychologist Ansel Keys decided to figure out how to help starving people recover after the war ended. So, he starved 36 men on purpose to find out. Keys recruited conscientious objectors who refused to fight but wanted to serve their country somehow. They volunteered thinking they'd be helping save lives, which was true, but nobody told them how brutal the experience would be. For 6 months, these men lived on about 1,500 calories a day doing physical labor. They lost massive amounts of weight, became weak and irritable, and developed serious depression. Food became their only obsession, and they'd hoard recipes and talk about meals constantly. Some had complete breakdowns, and a few mutilated themselves. One guy chopped off 3 of his own fingers, though he claimed it was an accident. The experiment provided valuable data that helped save lives after the war, but those volunteers paid a heavy psychological price that stuck with some of them for years. 7. The Pitești Experiment. Between 1949 and 1951, in communist Romania, authorities decided the best way to deal with political prisoners was to completely shatter their souls. They rounded up students and intellectuals who had the audacity not to love communism and threw them into Pitești prison for what they called re-education. The torture wasn't just physical. It was designed to destroy who these people were at their core. Prisoners got beaten, starved to sleep for days, and put through degrading rituals that are genuinely too disturbing to describe. And the worst part was that guards made them turn on each other. You had to torture your own cellmates and friends to prove your loyalty. And they weaponized human relationships to force good people into doing unspeakable things just to survive. Hundreds passed away. and the ones who made it out were never the same. 6. The doll test. In the 40s, psychologists Kenneth Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark wanted to understand how segregation was affecting black children's minds. So, they created the doll test. The results were heartbreaking. The Clarks showed young black children 2 dolls, one white and one black, and asked simple questions. Which doll is nice? Which one is bad? Which one looks like you? Over and over, the kids picked the white doll as the good one and the black doll as the bad one. Even when asked which doll looked most like them, many pointed to the black doll, but clearly didn't feel good about it. These weren't random answers. The children had already absorbed the message that white was better and black was inferior, and they were internalizing that racism before they even hit elementary school. Segregation wasn't just separating people, it was teaching kids to hate themselves. The Clarks presented their findings during Brown v. Board of Education, and it helped convince the Supreme Court that separate but equal was destroying children psychologically. 5. Colonoscopy Experiment. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman managed to make colonoscopies even worse than they already are, which honestly feels like an achievement. Kahneman split patients into 2 groups. The first got a standard colonoscopy that was uncomfortable but over relatively quickly. The second group had their procedure extended by leaving the scope inside an extra 3 minutes at the end, just sitting there, doing nothing, which meant more total discomfort overall. So, which group rated their experiences less terrible? The second one, because their colonoscopy ended on a less painful note. Kahneman called this the peak end rule. People judge experiences based on the worst moment and the final moment, not total amount of discomfort. Your brain doesn't average out pain over time, it just remembers the peak and the ending. 4. DHS Security Experiment. The Department of Homeland Security wanted to figure out how easy it would be to hack into secure networks by using the oldest trick in the book: human stupidity. Researchers scattered USB flash drives around parking lots near government buildings and corporate offices with no labels and no explanation. Then, they sat back and watched. 6 out of 10 people found random tech on the pavement and decided the smart move was to jam it into a secure network. When the USB drives had official-looking stickers or fake company logos, even more people plugged them in. One little sticker was all it took to make people trust something they literally found in a parking lot. No matter how good your firewalls are, humans will always be the weakest link. 3. Harlow's monkey experiments. Starting in the 50s, psychologist Harry Harlow ripped baby rhesus monkeys away from their real mothers and stuck them in cages with 2 fake ones. One mom was made of wire and had a bottle of milk, while the other was covered in soft cloth but had no food at all. Harlow wanted to see which one the babies would choose. The babies spent almost all their time clinging to the soft cloth mom, and only left her to grab a quick drink from the wire one before sprinting right back. Food kept them alive, but touch and warmth made them feel safe. Harlow proved babies don't just need calories, they need love. Then, things got darker. Harlow locked some monkeys in total isolation for months or even years, and when they finally came out, they were completely wrecked. They'd rock back and forth, hurt themselves, and couldn't figure out how to be around other monkeys. Some of them never recovered. His research changed how we understand attachment, but what a brutal way to learn it. 2. Baby Mozart effect studies. In 1993, researchers had college students listen to Mozart and then take spatial reasoning tests. They did slightly better for about 10 to 15 minutes afterwards, which was a minor temporary boost for adults and nothing more. Then someone decided this meant playing Mozart for babies would make them smarter permanently. Parents started buying Baby Mozart CDs and Baby Einstein videos, convinced they were giving their kids an IQ advantage, and companies made millions selling this stuff. Follow-up studies on actual infants showed basically nothing. Babies didn't get smarter, didn't develop faster, and didn't turn into geniuses. The whole thing was overblown hype based on one small study on adults that somehow morphed into a parenting phenomenon that made millions of parents feel guilty for not playing enough classical music. 1. McGurk effect experiments. In 1976, psychologists Harry McGurk and John McDonald discovered that your brain is a liar, and you can prove it in about 30 seconds. They showed people a video of someone saying one syllable, well, let's say ga, but dubbed over it with audio of a different syllable like ba. What did people hear? Neither one. Most heard a completely different sound like da that was never actually said at all. Their brains mashed the visual and audio information together and created something that didn't exist. This wasn't a fluke. The McGurk effect works on almost everyone, and even when you know it's happening, your brain still falls for it. You can watch the same video over and over, fully aware that the sound doesn't match the mouth movements, and your brain will keep lying to you anyway. The experiment proved that what we hear isn't just about sound, it's also about what we see. Your brain blends input from multiple senses to create your perception of reality, and sometimes it invents things that were never there. Psychology has some skeletons in its closet. A lot of them, actually. These experiments taught us things about human nature we probably needed to know, but the methods were inexcusable by today's standards. If you want to keep going down this rabbit hole, click here for 25 human experiments too disturbing to ignore. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and even if you're not new and haven't subscribed yet, still do that with that notification bell, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya. Let's run an experiment. How many of you actually don't? You know what? It's like psychology, reverse psychology. Don't click that bell. Don't subscribe.